My wife likes sewing and has asked for a cutting cart type thing. Probably the closest analogy to woodworking that I can come up with is it's sort of an outfeed and assembly table in one. It's a little bit higher than a sewing bench for cutting fabric, so you need it nice and big to cut a roll of fabric. If we had the space inside the house, I would basically just give her a sheet of plywood on some legs and that would be perfect. But unfortunately we don't, both to store or to use. So to store it, this cart is going to fold down. It's going to have two wings that fold up. So we've got two of these continuous hinges, piano hinges. And it's going to have some fold down legs. So there's some butt hinges as well. There's 4 of those. And because it's going to be fairly hefty when all said and done, we've also got 4 casters, 2 locking and swivel, 2 that are just straight casters. On the wood front, we've got 18mm BC radiata pine plywood. So the leftover from this plus another sheet. So let's get to it. The Wood Night is sponsored by I Would Like. I'd already broken down the sheets into slightly more manageable chunks so that I didn't have a full sheet of plywood hanging around the workshop. This still required a lot of large chunks though. The overall depth is 700mm, but the wings are just shy of 900mm wide. The bottom piece received a rabbet on either side and the top of the central portion got 2 dados. It's slightly wider to allow for the hinged wings. Before gluing up, I added some holes for shelf pins. I've used this jig before and I rated a solid OK. It was cheaper than the Craig jig at the time and it functions in pretty much the same way. There's nothing special about it. Glue up with the dados and rabbets is pretty straightforward, except for when there have been really hot and humid days and the plywood warps slightly. It doesn't help that this was kind of a monster sized cabinet too. I would have just used a nail gun instead of clamps, but it was about 6 AM when I was recording this. Way too early for power tools. To hide the plywood edges, I made some fairly chunky edge banding out of pine. These 90x45 pieces were left over from when I flattened my workbench. They just got glued and tacked into place. Once dried, the wings could be screwed onto the main carcass using those piano hinges. These came with very small Phillips head cesium grade screws. The legs are just strips of plywood. The lengths were a little bit variable, so they got chopped down. I had some issues with the legs not folding up properly, so I opted to go for a sliding mechanism so the leg height could be adjusted. The leg gets a single hole, while the foot, for lack of a better term, gets 2 pilot holes. Then it was over to the router table to extend the slot on the foot. This took several passes, flipping each time until I finally cut through. I hate doing plunge cuts on the router table. It is very important to wear eye protection while using hinges, apparently. I made a tray of sorts, and this was just a single 18mm thick piece of ply with drawer slides on it. This will house the sewing machine while it's not in use. To add some stiffness to the legs, I cut a strip to go across the 2 legs on each side, making a H shape. So more or less this is done. It needs a sand, it needs to be sealed, it needs a cat. So I'll seal it with some polyacrylic. I've got a tin of that I need to use up. It's heavy, it's about 1.5 sheets of plywood, but the general idea is that my wife can roll out however much she needs of fabric to cut it either with a rotary cutter or scissors, and it's not going to be falling around everywhere. So it's very similar to an outfeed table where you need to make it about half the size of your sheet goods or whatever so that it won't tip off, and fabric's not much different. A bit less stiff, but that's about it. So there's a few things I would have liked to have done better. The legs I'm not super happy with. They're just hinged. For the, I guess, foot portion, I'll put some side guides on it. I haven't yet, so that they don't twist since there's just that single pivot point. While trying to get it down off my workbench, I managed to drop it, so there's an awful big dent in the middle there. It is what it is. There is a drawer for a sewing machine just to store it. The sewing machine won't actually go on here to be used because it's too high. It's the right height for cutting fabric, but not for sewing. That'll just go on the dining table there. So if you're ever going to make something like this, I would suggest using lighter materials than 18mm plywood, because this is really heavy. Maybe the carcass make 18mm and the rest 12mm, because yeah, it's really heavy, particularly since we're upstairs. So it requires quite a lot of work to move. To get it back downstairs, I'm going to have to unscrew the 2 wings because yeah, it's just simply too back-breaking. So this design has a few issues, but I'm not entirely certain how to solve it. The wings come out quite far and the middle section's not all that large, and this is sort of similar to a miter saw stand, and what those typically will have is 2 supports that fold out, so they don't actually have any legs on the ground other than in the center portion. That wouldn't really work here because On those, all the weight is in the center. You've got the miter saw at, I don't know, 25, 30 kilos, and you're doing all the cutting right in the center. Whereas with this fabric cutting platform, you might be cutting here or here or here. So having it just a support that goes on a diagonal and doesn't touch the ground, you can tip the whole thing over because these wings are fairly weighty. And there's nothing sort of counterbalancing it. If the sewing machine was living there, that would be a different matter. It would add some counterbalance, but it's not. So, as I said, I'm not sure this is the best solution. Perhaps screw-on legs, so getting a mounting plate that goes on the underneath, and then every time you fold it up, just screw them on would work better. But we'll see. Thanks for watching.